Good morning, everyone. Okay. This is another event in our what's becoming a series of events on what is going on in the region. What we will try to do today is once again what we did last time, which is call Amr Hamzawi first. He is still in Cairo. Probably not in Tahrir Square today, but
not so much drama.
But in Cairo nevertheless. And so we will maybe spend half an hour listening from Amr to the latest developments in Egypt and take a few questions from the audience and then move to talk about what are the next steps as we go through this transformation in Egypt and other parts of the Arab world, and Marina Ottaway will do that, and then we will also hear from Michelle Dunn about implications for U.S. policy. That must be Amr. Let's give it 1 minute and see if we can hook up with Amr. If not, we will start with Marina until we can establish contact with Amr.
Can you speak loud?
Okay.
We can't read lips.
We can't.
It's not a good beginning.
We'll get him. We'll get him.
Thank you.
Well,
let's give it.
Jessica seems to be.
Okay.
Let's see what she reports. No.
Sorry, your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please check the number and try
One
your
more
call
time.
again, or contact your customer.
There we go. Nope. All right. Let's. Why don't we start with Marina and wait until we establish contact with Amr. So, Marina, the floor is yours.
Let me get going a bit on this. Good morning, first of all. I want to talk this morning about the issue of, what seems to be the indications about what is happening both in Egypt but also in Tunisia to some extent, because it gives some indication of where Egypt might go in terms of the process of changing the regime and the character of the regime. Because what we have seen in Egypt, as in Tunisia, is the removal of two presidents, but not the removal of two regimes. And in fact, there are plenty of indications that in many ways the regimes are fighting back. That is, that although there is and I don't want to dismiss as unimportant the fact that the president was removed, but the fact is that there is a lot more change that has to take place. What we have seen in Egypt very clearly is a transfer of power from Mubarak to the military that was, after all, the backbone of Mubarak's regime. We have not seen the transfer. There was no free officers coup. There was no military coup by junior officers. It is the same military establishment that supported Mubarak for all these years. We know, in addition to what we have known all along, if you look at the WikiLeaks, what was came out from WikiLeaks, that Field Marshal Tantawi, is very much of a conservative. It's an old school guy, that he's certainly not, he has never indicated any reformist tendencies, essentially. So the question is, how can then a process of this sort, which is now in the hands of the military, lead to further change in the country, lead to the dismantling, or much more, a much deeper dismantling of the regime itself. And the reason why I'm saying this is that it seemed quite clear that the protesters were not just settling for the removal of one man, that they really wanted change in the regime itself, that they wanted a deeper transformation of the country. What we are seeing, and here is where I see the analogy with Tunisia becoming very important, is a process of slow concession, a very slow process of making additional concession to protesters. The military started in Egypt very much with a command and control attitude. Essentially, we are going to do the transition. This is the timetable. There is going to be a very quick timetable as well. But we are going to be in control until the new government is formed. We are going to, the cabinet that, after all, Mubarak appointed, is going to stay in control until the next government, until a government is formed, after the constitution has taken place, after elections have taken place. We'll set up the jurist committee that is going to rewrite the constitution. In other words, it's very much a process from the top. And in that process, very little consultation appeared to be taking place. The military held talks with the youth groups. And when they suggested that they should also, that the talk should be broadened to include al-Baradei, to include some of the political coalition, the military was not too happy about this. There have been, of course, we don't know all the consultation that they have had. There have been selective consultation with various groups. This committee of jurists that was set up contains people, they are all jurists, but there are people from different tendencies, including the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. But these are all people appointed from the top. What we are seeing, though, that because the pressure is continuing, because there is continuing discontent being expressed, the military is now making further concessions. They have announced that they will that the cabinet is going to be reorganized, that they have given up on the idea of maintaining that cabinet for the next 6 months, essentially. We have not seen yet any signs that they want to make the process of writing the constitution more representative. In other words, for the time being, they are still assuming that writing the constitution is a technical job. That the constitution, essentially, it's a legal document, which it is, but they are not looking at the other side of the constitution, that the constitution is, before it becomes a legal document, it's a political agreement. In other words, the constitutions that last, the constitution that take hold, are constitutions that represent a compromise among all the political forces, political forces in the nation. Somebody then has to put that agreement into technical terms, into juridical terms, but in fact there has to be this underlining political agreement. There is no inkling yet that the military is accepting that this seems to be the situation. Okay, they are. I'll continue talking until they put this has to do with trying to reach Amr. So now I have lost track of where I was. Yes, there is no indication so far that the military is really accepting the fact that the process of writing a constitution is a political and not just a juridical process. it's not clear, and what we are seeing is still a concept of rewriting the Constitution more in terms of just amending a certain number of articles, the same articles that Mubarak mentioned, that were mentioned earlier on, which are the most offensive of the articles of the Constitution as far as the presidential elections are concerned. That is, the articles that made it very difficult for anybody to run except a representative of the NDP. So, but we are still dealing with a very restricted process, with a very limited process. Let me talk a bit about Tunisia and then come back to Egypt, because I think that helps put it in some perspective. Tunisia is interesting because it's a very similar process, except that it's not taking place under the control of the military, because essentially the Tunisians managed to save more of the older regimes, but getting rid of Ben Ali earlier on. Ben Ali was pushed out or resign, or whatever combination of the two. I mean, these resignations are not always totally voluntary, earlier on in the process, so that essentially the civilian regime was left fairly intact. And the civilian regime there started exactly the way the military started in Egypt. That is saying the cabinet is going to stay in control. They tried to add a few representatives from the opposition and from opposition party and the labor unions. The labor unions were government-controlled labor unions. The opposition parties are very small. They did not get very far with that because the labor unions in the end refused to participate, because they were trying to change their look, if you want, and they made an attempt to recast themselves as the representative of the protest, particularly the labor protest, although they did so without ever changing their leadership, which was really a problem because the leadership was the leadership of the government-controlled union. So they started with the same attitude. We are going to change very little, and you know, of course, that the president now was the Speaker of Parliament, so again a member of the older regime, and the Prime Minister is the same person. Little by little, this group in power had to make a whole series of concessions. They had to change, they had to replace a lot of the ministers. They started out trying to separate themselves from the party, which, by the way, is something that we are seeing taking place in Egypt now, where people are resigning from the party in droves, essentially, try to become respectable again, and probably to save the possibility of having a political career again, I think, in many cases. So you have people resigning, beginning with Carnegie and the president resigning from the RCD. Then you had all the members of the cabinet resigning from the RCD. Then you have sort of a cabinet reshuffle. Then you have not the banning, but the suspension of the RCD, whatever that means. I don't think it's going to be unsuspended. Okay. Let me just finish the sentence, and then we'll let Amra talk. So little by little, I think we are seeing a cabinet or a leadership in Egypt, in Tunisia, that has to take steps and distance itself from the older regime. But still, it's one step at a time. They make as small a concession as they can until they are forced to make a bigger concession. Let me stop here and come back to that later on.
Thank you, Marina. Let me see if Amr is with us now. Amr, can you hear me? Hello? He's gone? I'm sorry about this, but so
sometimes long-distance communications don't work very much.
You want to go ahead then?
Okay, yeah. Let me try and go ahead later. And I hope you'll forgive me if I don't sound totally coherent when I'm finished with this talk. Okay, so we have this step-by-step approach. The regime tried to protect itself, tried to maintain its power as much as possible, small concessions being made. We have not seen the big changes in in Tunisia yet. I mean, I think we are in an intermediate situation where it's certainly not the Ben Ali regime in its entirety, the way it was in the first week after the change took place, but it's still a very, very controlled process of transition, and very much a process of transition in which the most important movers remain two. One is the protesters, that are the ones who are still putting pressure on the regime, and the second is the members of the older regime that are driving this. Now, let me go back to Egypt and say what is the lesson for Egypt here. And there are two very important points that need to be kept in mind. One is the enormous importance of continued pressure on the regime, because if there was no pressure on the military, I think we would have essentially the regime reproducing itself minus Mubarak and minus some limited concessions, essentially. Yes, there is no doubt that they intend to that will change some of the articles of the constitutions. They'll have to make some concessions in terms of allowing more political parties to register, but there is no indication yet about, for example, who is going to register the political parties at this point. What is the process that allows the political parties to register? There is no indication yet about what kind of election law is going to be used particularly for the parliamentary election. I mean, the presidential elections is simpler and so on. So the lesson of Tunisia is that unless there is continued pressure, the reforms are going to be very modest, that the regime will, what's left of the regime will continue protecting itself. The second point, and I think it's the one that to me is more disturbing, is that in this particular phase of the process, street protest is a very poor way of maintaining pressure on the regime, because street protest is extremely effective, as we have seen, in tearing down a regime. You don't negotiate a new constitution through street protest, essentially. You don't negotiate a new law on political parties through street protest. You can put the incumbent leadership on notice that what they are doing is not enough, but in order for the opposition to have an impact, they have to get into a process of negotiation, a process of bargaining. And I think we are still not seeing a very clear indications that the opposition, as it is now, is well placed to do that it is capable of really entering into this process. There are two problems. One is that we know, there are probably more than two problems. One, and we know that the opposition is weak, by and large. The opposition, the political opposition, as contrasted to the protesters in the streets, are the old opposition, let me put it this way, the political parties and so on, are weak. We have been writing about this. We have been knowing it for a long time, essentially. They are weak because they were not allowed to function. They are weak because they have had a serious problem of leadership. They are weak because many of the political parties are, like the old Egyptian regime, are gerontocracies. I mean, they have not renewed their leadership and so on and so forth. They are divided. The Muslim Brotherhood is divided itself, much more so than we have seen it divided in the 6 or 7 years on which we have worked on that organization. They really they speak with a lot of different voices at this point in terms of what they want. And but in addition, they are also weak because they don't dare moving too far to the front of the opposition. They are still afraid of a crackdown. They are still afraid that if they should put themselves in a situation where they seem to have too much power, too much influence, there is going to be a very negative reaction against it. So the Muslim Brotherhood are holding back. The secular parties, if I can call that, are not very strong to begin with. And the protesters are extremely divided, because while in we are beginning to see leadership emerging from the protest movement. We are learning, and this is very interesting in contrast to Tunisia, because in Tunisia there is not a single name that has come out of the protest movement. We see a lot of names that are beginning to come up. There are people that come from the youth movement, from the leadership of the protest movement, who really have been catapulted in important positions. They are extremely young, and none of them can be said to represent the entire protest movement, because the protest movement is very, very divided, and we are seeing, in fact, the squabbles beginning in the ranks of the protest movement. If any of you were listening to NPR this morning, there were some very telling interviews that took place with some of the members of, they are beginning to accuse each other. We are the ones who organized it, but they are trying to take credit for it now, and they are trying to build their political career. Unexpected? No, of course not. This is a classic. I mean, you can write the script before it happens, in a sense, but the fact is that that's the situation, that they are divided and so on. So that what we have, the situation now is still very united military, because so far we have seen there was some speculation at one point whether the military would start showing divisions, particularly before Mubarak left. There is no indications that we can see at this point that the military has cracked, that the military is dividing. We have on the other side an opposition which is still rather weak, and it's disorganized, and it's beginning to show the usual fragmentation, the usual fissures that you see in situations of this kind. And you see, and that in the end plays in the hands of the old regime, because they are united, they are in power, let's face it. And the opposition still has as its main tools the possibility of protest rather than the possibility of negotiations. I leave it at that because I don't want to speculate too much. Just a reminder of a lot of things that that are still very much question mark in terms of where the country is going, that will give some indications of where it's going. The fate of the NDP. The NDP still exists. I think it's at least nobody has eliminated it. It has lost its headquarters, and it has lost a lot of its members. There have not been many statements coming out of the NDP, but I don't think we can assume that it has totally disappeared as a political force, particularly because in an election, I think it would probably, from the point of view of the military, it could still serve a useful purpose. If we see what has happened in other countries that have had transitions of this sort, and here I think turning to Eastern Europe, maybe it's an interesting reminder of some of the things to look out for, not of what is bound to happen, but things to look out for, is probably new parties emerging from the ranks of the old NDP. In other words, people who were in the party, in these situations where you have de facto single party system, or at least dominant party systems, right? Political animals tend to gravitate by definition towards that political party. If you have political ambitions, that's where you end up by being. Whether there is an ideology or not, but that's where people end up by gravitating towards, because there are really no other outlet. And those are people usually who, in this transition, reemerge then at the head of new political parties, at the head of new political forces, trying to remain players in whatever new game is going to be is being played. So I think this is the fate of the NDP. To me, is something that needs to be watched very, very closely. As of course, as soon as the possibility of forming new political parties arises, what kind of parties are being formed. No new political parties can be formed now, can be registered now, because there is no mechanism for registering political parties. So it's all suspended. So we are still a very long way from knowing where we are going. I think there is a lot of there are far too many references in the press, in the media, to the demise of the old regime. And I think that is really a misreading of the situation, because Mubarak is gone. Ben Ali are gone, but the old regimes are still fighting for survival. I'm not saying that they have been wounded, but they are still. I'm not sure that they are terminal, and they certainly still have a lot of fight in them. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Marina. Just got a text message from Amr saying that he has been waiting, but apparently there are technical difficulties. So we will. I apologize for that. Let me turn it over to Michelle to talk about implications for U.S. policy.
Thank you, Marwan. I'll make a few comments on the situation in Egypt and then say a couple of things too about what this means for the U.S. right now. I think there's really a balancing act going on right now with the military Supreme Council of the military that's running Egypt in terms of timing. On the one hand, they want to be seen as moving forward quickly enough that they look as though they're taking the right steps for a transition to democracy, whether that's really their intention or not. As Marina indicated, they want to look that way. But then on the other hand, they're also being accused of moving too quickly in some senses. I mean, for example, being eager to hold elections within 6 months and hand over control. So there's a little bit of, I think, of a push and pull regarding the timing. They've taken a number of steps that have been concessions to the demonstrators in recent days. Marina mentioned the Constitutional Reform Committee, and the statement that the cabinet will be replaced, although I think not the prime minister. I think they'll keep Ahmed Shafiq as the prime minister, but have him announce a different cabinet. But they haven't, of course, met all the demands. Notably, they haven't lifted the state of emergency. They seem to be using that as a bargaining chip, basically, to get the demonstrators to go home with some sort of a promise that once things have calmed down again, they will lift the state of emergency. So that's something to watch out for, to see if that happens. And as Marina indicated, they have set in motion a process to amend the Constitution, not to replace it. The demonstrators, most of them at least, had been asking for convening a constituent assembly and drafting a whole new constitution. And what the military is doing is a more limited version of that. The Constitutional Committee, though, seems to be hard at work. Some of the members have said that they already have the drafted amendments in hand, and they're already moving on to the laws. Of course, there are laws separate from the Constitution itself that are related to the specific amendments that themselves would need to be amended to pave the way for elections. So that is going forward. Curiously, the one article of the Constitution that hasn't been mentioned yet is Article 5, which is the one that says that you cannot form a political party with a religious frame of reference. Undoubtedly, with the Muslim Brotherhood wants that changed, and so that'll be interesting to see if they make any changes to that. That's not on the list of articles that they've announced publicly are going to be amended. Regarding the opposition, now, one thing that I agree with Marina that there do seem to be consultations going on between the Supreme Council of the military and the demonstrators and perhaps some people in the opposition, but it's not really a negotiation at this point. And it's not entirely clear whether that's because the military doesn't want to negotiate with certain people or because the opposition and demonstrators haven't organized themselves yet. And let's remember, we're only 5 days into this process, right? It's only 5 days since Mubarak left. I'm maybe slightly more optimistic than you, Marina, that the opposition will be able to pull themselves together a little bit more cohesively to organize with the military. I think they're aware of this challenge, but of course the problem you have here is you have old opposition groups, including the old parties such as the Weft, etc., and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is part of the old opposition. You have a newer opposition, groups that emerged over the last 5 years or so, whether we're talking about National Association for Change, April 6th Youth Movement, Al Ghad Party, etc. And then you have the new opposition that actually emerged out of this revolution. And there's talk of, forming a new party, a January 25th party, and so forth. So you've got these different generations, so to speak, within the opposition having to deal with each other. There are, it'd be great to hear what Ahmed has to say about this, if we get him on the line, about where efforts stand. But there definitely are efforts for these groups, or at least most of them, to pull together into some sort of a cohesive body. Regarding the old regime and whether it will resurface or so forth, Marina talked about the NDP, and that's interesting to watch. They actually now, I just saw a report that there was actually an NDP meeting Monday or Tuesday, and they have a new head of the NDP, Mohamed Ragab, who was an old member of the NDP. So they're trying to pull themselves back together in some form. It's really hard to tell at this point whether that would be viable at all, or whether they will either break apart into different parties or need to totally reinvent themselves. I mean, my sense is that they're going to need to totally reinvent themselves. One of the, and there are question marks. There are people who have gone very quiet, and we're not sure exactly where they are, what they're doing, and whether they will reemerge as players somehow. I think Amr Suleiman is a very interesting case. The vice president that Mohammed named, that Mubarak named, the former head of intelligence. I mean, where is he in this situation, and does he have? Is he going to reemerge as a player here or not? Personally, I think it would not be a good sign if he does. But because he's very much of the old regime. Now, related to that, the other really big question, I think, is the security apparatus. They've got 1 million plus police and internal security officers, and we've already seen problems. The military issued in one of their communiques a statement basically that we're all going to play nicely together now. The police and internal security will retake up their duties, but they will not, abuse the citizens, and the citizens will respect the police and so forth. But, just saying it doesn't make it so. And I think there's going to have to be some thinking. I don't know whether this will happen in the transitional period, but if it doesn't happen soon, I see trouble there. There's a real need to rethink the role and the behavior of the internal security, the police. This is a very, very deep and broad issue in Egypt that's could be a real problem going forward. Another big vulnerability, and I'm going to sort of set aside, I think Marina covered pretty well all the sort of political questions about how profound a political transition are we seeing and so forth, the constitutional, legal, electoral questions. Let me set that aside for a minute, though, and just say briefly about the economy. This, I think, is a major vulnerability going ahead, even if the political transition goes well or relatively smoothly. Typically in these kind of situations, even in democratic transitions, the economy is a major vulnerability. We're seeing a lot of labor protests, and the military leadership very much wants people to go back to work and so forth, but they're having a hard time with this. We're seeing labor protests all over Egypt, state workers, private sector, all kinds of workers striking and so forth. And so it's kind of difficult to put that back into the box at this point and get people back to work. Also, the whole economic reform team that Mubarak had in place from 2004 onwards now has been swept out of power, and whereas we might see other symbols of the old regime returning, I'm doubtful whether we're going to see those people returning. Many of them now are under suspicion of or actual accusations of corruption, have had their assets frozen, travel bans slapped on them. There are news stories every day about suits being filed against them and so forth. So what I'm saying is the whole economic philosophy and the economic reform philosophy that Egypt was proceeding on for the last at least 6-7 years, actually much longer than that, has been swept aside, and we're not quite sure what's going to emerge in its place, except that it's likely to be a lot more populist, and there's going to be a re-emphasis, at least in the short term, on state control of the economy and state provision of welfare and basic commodities and subsidies and so forth to the population. So let me turn here briefly to to challenges for the United States. Now, there's been a very big change in U.S. rhetoric on these subjects in recent days, okay, on the whole subject of change in the Arab world, political change. I mean, I was really struck, for example, by the readout of President Obama's calls on February 12th. He had calls to the prime ministers of UK and Turkey and also King of Jordan. And one of the things that it says during this call, the president emphasized his conviction that democracy will bring more, not less, stability to the region. Was that George Bush speaking, or that was President Obama? There's been a real, been a real change in the way that the U.S. administration is dealing with these issues, as we've seen widely reported in the American press. It does seem that President Obama has become, determined we are going to ride this wave and not be swept under it. There's a lot of engagement going on, and of course they're following up on all these questions about how real these transitions are and how stable they are. I think U.S. officials are doing this in it's a very confusing environment. They're trying to figure out who their interlocutors are or need to be. Clearly, most of the people they were talking to in a place like Egypt have left. I mean, the foreign minister is still there. I don't know whether he'll survive in the new cabinet or not. The top defense leadership is there, but everybody else basically is gone. So they're having to start all over again and figure out, to whom to speak and figure out what's going on. I think, too, while there's a lot of emphasis on the political transition, there's already thinking about this economic challenge and how the United States can work with the international community in sort of supporting, making sure we don't have a really dire economic situation in a country like Egypt as it tries to move through a political transition, but that is going to present us with a lot of challenges because of what I mentioned about the economic philosophy. I think that I don't know how the international community is going to feel, for example, about giving budget support to an Egyptian government who's going to be turning it around in a lot of subsidies. This was the kind of behavior that we were trying to move Egypt off of for 30 years, getting away from subsidizing commodities and instead, developing the market economy and also moving into a system of social welfare payments. But in the short term, in the next few years, we're going to see a completely different imperative, and I think we're going to face some difficult decisions about what we need to do to support this transition, and perhaps doing things that go a bit against the economic philosophy we normally pursue. I'll stop there for now.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. Let's open it up. I'm not sure we're going to get Amr back, so let's open it. Yes, sir. If you can identify yourself and please limit it to questions.
Judd Harriet, documentary filmmaker. Given what Marina and Michelle have said about the presidents being gone, but the regime not having changed so much, and in respect to U.S. policy, what can we do to promote this? For example, could we, really promote the idea of a constituent assembly? But my question is, what could we do to promote regime change, not simply the presidents?
Let's take a few questions at a time, and then, please.
My name is Mohammed Shinna, the Voice of America. Dr. Masher, what kind of reforms Arab leaders should implement to avoid the repetition of the Egyptian experience, and would reforms vary from monarchies to republics?
Okay. Let's take one in the back over there, please. Yes.
Khaled Al-Gindi, visiting fellow, Brookings Institution. Michelle, you mentioned that it would be a disturbing development if Omar Suleiman were to reemerge somehow on the political scene. I'm wondering if you could comment on their report. I mean, obviously we know that Field Marshal Tantawi is the head of the council and essentially ruling the country. But he's also someone with very close ties to Mubarak historically, and even derogatorily referred to as Mubarak's poodle. I've seen some reports that maybe these are conspiracy theories, but if you could address this in the context of the credibility of the military command. I've seen some reports that suggest that Mubarak may actually be in contact with Tantawi and possibly even sort of manipulating things from behind the scenes. How credible is that, or how likely is it? I suppose it has to do with the issue of the ability of the regime to hang on.
All right, let's maybe take this back.
Let me, interesting question, the issue of US and regime change. I'll start with the, first by throwing back a question to you and to all of you. Does the US really want regime change? In other words, no, I think it's very important. If you look at, the US has always wanted in Arab countries, and you see in the statements that Obama is making and so on, he's always wanted the reform, and has always wanted the reform from the top. The US really, and this is true even under Bush, what the US wanted is these regimes to become more open, to start implementing some reforms, but not to lose control, not to do it in such a way, and keep in mind that there is this boogeyman for the United States, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. So that I think the reform that was envisaged was always a slow liberalization of the regime, essentially. And if you look at some of the statements that Obama is making now, that telling other Arab regimes, you have to move, you have to stay ahead of your population, essentially. It's really the idea of reform from the top. Let me add something, that at this point, the best contacts that the Obama administration has, or any US administration, this is not Obama or anybody else, is with the military. So that I think there is a degree of comfort in this transition, which is still very much controlled by the military. That I don't mean to imply that the US would be quite happy with the situation staying exactly as it is, but I think the scenario with which the US feels more comfortable, and for good reasons, is reform from the top rather than an upheaval from the bottom. Revolutions are not nice things, by and large. They are open-ended processes, you don't know where they end up, and so on, so that in fact a process of reform is much more reassuring. So I think it's, in terms of the second part of your question, what can the US do in terms of influencing the process? You think perhaps suggesting a constitutional assembly, that kind of thing. I don't think the US is very much of a player on this. I think there are already so many players. There are already so many ideas coming from inside. And I think it's really going to be an internal process, much more than whatever the US might suggest as an overall transition pattern, at least in my opinion. I will not talk about, on the issue of what kind of reforms they can implement. Actually, I think I'd be more comfortable to let Marwan address that issue. That really is his issue. Let me just make one comment, that in a sense the monarchies can do more. Because monarchs are, and I don't think it's going to happen, but monarchs are the only ones who can remain in power and still carry out very deep reforms, because a president cannot become a constitutional president, if I can put it that way. A monarch can always become a constitutional monarch. I don't see many indication that is what's happening. On the other question, I don't know. I mean, I think it's easy to become conspiratorial about Mubarak still being sort of manipulating the issue from behind the scene. I have no information that allows me to address that issue.
Michelle?
Okay, let's see. On the first question, what can the U.S. do to promote real regime change in Egypt? Look, I sort of agree with Marina that the main action is in Egypt. I mean, the U.S. is a player here, but kind of on the margins. And I do think it's important for the U.S. administration to be supporting, as it has been, the legitimacy of the demands of the protesters and the opposition. That, I mean, in the main, some people among the protesters are asking for slightly different things, but there's a core. There's a core of steps that is generally agreed on and among the opposition and the protesters. And the U.S. should be supporting that, both in public remarks and in private context with the military. Then there's the whole question of the aid package. And it really is time now, and I'm sure this will happen, to rethink it, right? We've been giving this $1.3 billion in military aid, $250 million in economic aid. That's been the package at least for the last few years. The military aid goes way, way back. The economic aid, used to be much more and has come down. It really is time to rethink this, and it might be time for a more robust package of economic assistance, and I think it should be done in cooperation with Europe, and perhaps we'll see with international financial institutions as well, of if they really are on a transition of some kind, and with the caveat that I mentioned that we might end up doing some things that we're not really comfortable with in terms of what the Egyptians will want to do with the money. We'll want to just put it out there in the population. But I think we're going to have to think about that. So it really is time to rethink the aid package. Briefly, what kinds of reforms should Arab leaders undertake? Look, the core issue here is that throughout the Arab world, in almost every country, there are a couple of examples. You've got an executive, whether it's a king or a president, who is not freely chosen and who holds most of the power in his hands. That's the core issue. So, can there be a process of redistribution of some of this power to elected bodies, to the parliament and so forth, and creation of parliaments in some places where they don't even exist? And can there be, at a minimum, sort of more alternation in power? I mean, we've already seen, like, for example, the Yemeni president announcing that he won't run again and so forth. There needs to be clearly this phenomenon of presidents staying in power for decades is highly problematic. So at a minimum, I think these are some of the changes that are going to be made. Beyond that, I mean, it really varies a lot from country to country about what specific things. I mean, Bahrain is very hot right now, and we know that there are particular issues there related to a very underrepresented majority Shia population. So each country has its specific issues. Briefly on the Mubarak contact with Tantawi and so forth, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, the two rumors I heard about Mubarak recently is, A, he's in a coma, B, he's hard at work on his memoirs. I don't know. I don't know what's going on with Mubarak down in Sharm el-Sheikh, but I sort of doubt that Mubarak is really useful to the military leadership at this point. But let me raise sort of a related thing. I think it's going to be interesting to see going forward, especially as we move toward a presidential election. And, you know, there's a question as to what should come first, parliamentary elections or presidential election. But it does seem that the military's priority is to hold a presidential election because that's what allows them to hand over power, right? Because the Supreme Council of the Military is standing in place of the presidency right now, not the parliament. As we all know, the parliament is not essential to the running of the Egyptian system. So that they want to hold a presidential election. It's going to be really interesting to see whether the military has a candidate in that. And of course, the leading suspect for that would be Ahmed Shafiq, the current prime minister, who was spoken of as a possible successor for Mubarak. So that's going to be something interesting to watch. Now, arguably, if they hold a free and fair election and they allow other credible candidates and so forth, and you know, a former military officer like Ahmed Shafiq were to win the election, you know, that's not necessarily a problem, but we'll have to see, you know, whether they try to manipulate or skew the system going forward to favor a candidate supported by the military.
Let me try to briefly address it. The question addressed to me about the kind of reforms Arab leaders need to implement, the serious kind. In the past, Arab governments have engaged in ad hoc programs here and there that did not add up to a reform process. And in my view, the reform process has to extend way beyond conducting elections or conducting free elections. That's just one of many aspects of reform that have to be done. A first step, in my view, would be a consultative, inclusive sort of program on reform that is not done by the government only, that is done in consultation with all sectors of society, that would come up with a blueprint for, you know, political, economic, and social reform, and that would not stop at rhetorical statements. We've seen a rhetorical statement in Tunis in 2004, ironically in Tunis, with all Arab governments committing to a blueprint for reform, which was actually a good beginning in that they at least identified the areas that they need to work on, but did not identify any timelines, any performance indicators, so in that sense, it was less serious as it only dealt with generalities. What needs to be done is a roadmap, in my view, once again, that is done in consultation with the different political, economic, and social forces in society, that would talk about power sharing, strong parliaments, and therefore, you know, changes in the election law, that would talk about an independent judiciary, about a free press, about addressing corruption, about paying attention to human rights. It has to be comprehensive. And that is why I also agree with Marina. It is best if it comes from above. Reform from above, you know, is gradual. If it is serious, is gradual, and can look at all these different aspects. If it is not possible to do it from above, we will all watch it, as we have seen in Egypt, happen from below. But if you want a gradual and serious process, if it is done from above, in my view, that would be best. Saeed. Can we maybe address the question to a particular, so that we don't end up, you know, answering all questions at once in the interest of time? Please.
My name is Saeed Erkat from Al-Quds Daily. First of all, I want to thank Carnegie for keeping us informed, and I look forward to a very busy calendar ahead as we go through the following 20 Arab countries. My question is to Dr. Muashar. The Egyptian revolution was remarkable in so many ways, but it was also remarkable in being devoid of Islamist slogans, pan-Arabist slogans, or even anti-American slogans. What are the chances of Egypt reassuming its pan-Arabist leadership, as was the case during the Nasserist era? Thank you.
Okay. Please, Sam.
Thank you. Michael Lame, Rethink the Middle East. One for Marina and one for Michelle. Marina, I'd like you to talk about is there a religious debate going on in the country now? Article 5 was mentioned, but could that, I mean, if there's a Muslim Brotherhood as a political party, there could be a Coptic party, or is there a sense that there should be a separation of mosque and state, church and state? And where would the U.S. come out on that? And Michelle, on the economics, in addition to the political cause of the protest, there was economic cause. There's the youth bubble, high unemployment, poverty. Do we have a sense that a more democratic regime would be any more successful in dealing with those issues? And if they're not, would we see another round of protests? Subsidies, food subsidies clearly don't address those kind of long-term developmental issues.
Yes, sir.
Daniel Mora, Johns Hopkins University. The question is for Marine. I think we have just two alternatives, realistically, looking at the Arab country situation. Or we do an Iraqi-style measure. We cut the power, and you see the result in Iraq. Or we keep the only working body inside these countries, which is, in the case of Egypt, the army. In the case of Tunisia, I don't think, because you know that the police is roughly 10 times more than the army in Tunisia. I would like to stress one point. I think we don't have to lose contact with the Tunisian for two reasons. The first is that it's a small country and is historically a bridge between Europe and Western values and the Arabic country. And it's easier to help immediately these guys to give, again, a model, a workable model for transition. I just remember you something, being me an Italian. When Mussolini fell down in 1943, the Americans put in power an army man that was Generale Badoglio. And the transition was taking some years, and not weeks. It's impossible to have a transition. After 20, 30 years of dictatorship, there is no one apart from the army able to govern a country.
Okay, can we take this set of questions then?
Okay, question of the religious parties and so on. The real question is the Muslim Brotherhood going to be allowed to register as a political party? If the Muslim Brotherhood is allowed to register, then a Coptic party is going to be allowed to register if they, if they want to form one. I mean, if anybody wants to form one, the battle is going to be over the Muslim Brotherhood, it seems to me. And I find it very difficult to believe that at this point they can avoid allowing the Muslim Brotherhood to register a political party. The question is what kind of limitations are going to try and put? What kind, where are the boundaries? But I think the problem in Egypt, and it has always been the problem, and it has always been the problem for U.S. policy, is that if you do not, if the Muslim Brotherhood has as much influence in the country as if we fear it has, if it, there is this fear that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to take over in an election. I don't think that's the case for a number of reasons I won't go into here. But if the Muslim Brotherhood had that much power, and that much influence, the only way to keep it out of the competition would be an extremely repressive regime. So that essentially there is no way to have a democratic system, essentially, unless the Muslim Brotherhood is allowed to form a political party. Let me point out that there are 6 countries in the, if you include Egypt earlier, there are 6 countries in the Arab world where Islamist parties are represented in the parliament. In Algeria, they are even represented in the government. And in none of these countries, they have taken over. There is not, so that it's not, there is nothing unprecedented there. I don't think the issue of a Coptic party worries anybody in particular, because it would, because this is a minority, and therefore it would not be, it would not be seen as threatening by quite in the same way. The issue of the gradual transition and the slow transition and so on, What we know, I think in theory I totally agree, the same way as I totally agree with Marwan, a slow transition, a process of reform is always better than a revolution. But that's the theory. Then the practice is what we see is that a lot of these governments don't want to get involved in reform until it becomes too late and then the situation gets out of hand. I mean, one of my concerns is that I think the kind of process, it might be too late in this kind of very inflamed public opinion situation that we are facing in the Arab world for the kind of process Marwan was talking about to really unfold. I hope I'm wrong, but I think events may be unfolding a bit too fast for that scenario to be realistic. The other issue you talked about, the two-stage, you used the example of Italy and the two-stage process and so on. I think by and large, this kind of two-step transition may in fact be better, but again, we are talking in theory. What we have seen in a lot of countries, and we have looked at a lot of transition without going back to 1945, we have seen a lot of transitions in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, and so on. And there is no doubt that very hurried elections, transitional elections that are held prematurely are dangerous. They do not necessarily lead to good results. So I think in theory there would be a lot to be said for a two-stage process, because the problem that Egypt faces now is that you cannot have a 2-year transition process with a military in power all by itself. That is never going to fly, right? So, but in order to have, so the military is saying, let's have an election in 6 months. Nobody's going to be ready for elections in 6 months. I mean, if you know anything about the opposition parties in Egypt right now, I think they need more than 6 months to be ready for elections, particularly given the fact that we don't even know when, there is a danger that the election laws will not be published until 6 weeks before the election takes place and so on. Now, that's the theory. In practice, it's a question of what they can negotiate. And right now, and I go back to my argument earlier on, right now the power is still pretty much in the hands of the military.
Regarding your question, Michael, about whether a democratic regime is going to be more successful in handling the economic questions. Well, I mean, you're quite right that, economic grievances were right at the root of these protests. I mean, what was so striking about them was how all these various grievances, economic grievances, human rights grievances, and so forth, came together in a specific political goal, which is change the regime, right? That's the thing that have been so many protests going on over the last few years in Egypt. But of course, there's a very high likelihood, I think, of Egyptians having unrealistic expectations that their economic conditions are going to improve rapidly. And frankly, there's no reason to believe that that's going to be true. I think that people, too, have unrealistic ideas that somehow the confiscated assets of former regime officials, and by the way, right now they're not confiscated, they're just frozen. We don't know exactly what will happen with them, but that is somehow going to provide, welfare for 85 million Egyptians. It's very unrealistic. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a real problem in terms of the unemployment problem. Look, what had happened was the old regime was carrying out these structural economic reforms, and they were aimed at facilitating investment, domestic investment and foreign investment inside of Egypt. But the trickle-down benefits of that were just not happening quickly enough. I mean, they ran out of time, basically. I mean, if it had been a politically stable situation, perhaps if they had been able to pursue these structural reforms over a much longer period, that eventually the benefits would have been felt at the lower part of the spectrum. Now, there was a lot of corruption. I mean, there were a lot of for example, state land allocated for private development by people, associated with the regime, either in the regime, former military, or in the ruling party, members of parliament, and so forth, and also easy credit, sweetheart loans, and so forth. Now, if you stopped those kind of practices, would that mean there's more to go around for everybody else? I don't know. I mean, a little bit, but I am worried about this, that, the development part of this. The other thing that's got to be fixed is the educational system. There's been disastrous deterioration in the educational system, which has meant that young Egyptians were not prepared to take the jobs that were being generated, and companies, both foreign and Egyptian companies, complained consistently about that. These are long-term problems, right? You don't fix something like that overnight. So there are no easy fixes here on the economic side, and like I said, I just don't have any sense right now of what kind of people will be coming into the government and with what kind of economic philosophy.
On the Egyptian protests and demonstrations, indeed, there are many positive attributes. What Saeed has referred to, yes, it has been totally non-ideological. We haven't seen slogans against the U.S., against Israel, against colonialism, this has been truly about governance. People want to see better government, and that is extremely positive in my view. There are also other positive attributes. They have been peaceful. Even when they were attacked, the demonstrators were peaceful. For the most part, not for the most part, they were peaceful. A high civic sense, people came and cleaned Tahrir Square after the protests were over, etc. Whether this will turn into, whether Egypt will sort of regain pan-Arab credentials, I think pan-Arab discourse really basically is dead, okay, for all practical purposes. I don't think that it can be revived in its old way, and I'm not sure the Egyptians want to revive it in its old way. I think this is, we're seeing a new era where the old thinking of the 50s and is not, I think, is not going to be revived. But that does not mean that there won't be implications on the region. People talk about, in this town, all the time about Israel. What does that mean in terms of Israel? Okay, is this going to mean, an abrogating of the peace treaty with Israel? Is this going to mean a change of relations with Israel, etc.? And whereas I was certainly frustrated by frankly, the focus on Israel, on what really is a domestic issue with governance, I do think there will be implications on Israel, but not in the sense that the peace treaty will be abrogated. I don't think the peace treaty will be abrogated with any new Egyptian regime. But I think there are at least two issues that Israel will have to revisit as a result of what we have seen in Egypt. The first issue is Israel cannot, from now on, in my view, with the same breath, say that they are the only democracy in the Arab world, but then stand against any other democracy trying to emerge. That situation, that position is not sustainable. And in fact, I think that Israel has already been in conflict with some of its strong supporters in the U.S. who could not understand the Israeli government's prodding of the Obama administration to stand by Mubarak and to basically prevent the protesters from achieving their objectives. The other issue that Israel, in my view, will have to also look at seriously is the issue of the occupation. I've seen a very interesting statement by Natan Sharansky a couple of days ago, saying that this proves, what happened in Egypt proves, that when people yearn for freedom, nothing can stop them. I don't know if he was thinking about all the implications that his statement meant, but it will also be difficult, in my view, for even the public here to support Arab publics yearning for freedom in Arab countries but stop short of supporting Palestinians from also yearning for freedom in the occupied territories. Okay, please.
Victor Shaloub, Al Bayan newspaper in Dubai. The administration has voiced strong support for the Iranian opposition, with strong condemnation for the regime, which is rightly so, but still so timid about other opposition in the region, mainly Yemen, Algeria. Is that reflect still a confusion in the administration, a divide, knowing that those regimes, in light of what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, there is no way that you can expect a reform from those regimes. So why do you think, for Ariana, why do you think the administration is still talking two languages with respect to this enormous wave that's sweeping the region?
Please, sir.
Amin Mahmoud with the Egyptian Association for Change, USA. A question to Michelle. First, I would like to say one thing, that the Egyptian revolution started with the youth for the first 3 days and changed to Egyptian revolution, mean all the Egyptians. My concern of the role of the United States will remain, because they play a role during the Mubarak stay in 18 days, United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the close relation between the military leader who now in power and the American administration, in particular Pentagon, and they receive money, a huge amount of money. Well, I will not mention what I heard, but that's concern that United States will remain playing a role from behind the scene, and I'd like to know your opinion. We're concerned about that.
Something back, yes, sir.
Daniel Serwer from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I wanted to comment on the question of U.S. assistance. I think Michelle is right that the Egyptians are going to be stepping back from structural reforms. And I don't see any reason in the world why the U.S. should play a strong role in supporting a step back from structural reforms. Egyptians are entitled to do it, but I think we should step back from economic assistance and let the IMF and World Bank handle those questions. I was about to agree with Muasha about the need for a broad roundtable of consultation in Egypt, but then he said it should be top down, and I disagree with that. I think we should support, as we have not done in similar situations in other countries, we should support a broad process of consultation from the grassroots. I'd like to see 100 million of those economic support dollars go to grassroots organizing in preparation for not only elections, but a much more democratic culture in Egypt. It is not only going to take more than 6 months, it's going to take a lot more money, and it's going to take donors who are truly generous with the people who brought this revolution about.
Yes, over in the back.
Sahar Aziz with Georgetown Law School. I wanted to inquire as to the feasibility of transferring power from the military council to a civilian council so that that 6-month period can be extended into something more reasonable. Because I agree that having a military regime for longer than 6 months is very problematic, and they will likely be less willing to cede their power as time proceeds. But is it possible from a legal perspective, but also from, I guess, a policy perspective, to push for them to transfer, to make that council a civilian council and have maybe 1 or 2 military representatives, and then they would be the transitional rulers for 12 months or 18 months, however long it takes, so that you can have meaningful elections?
Let's take one more question. Yes, sir. And then we'll allow Michelle and Marina to have the final point.
Hi, I'm Jason Erb, independent consultant. I have a question. There's a lot of comparisons between what's happening in Egypt and what happened in Iran in 1979, and with the Turkish model, where the military basically has allowed a somewhat controlled process of reform and pseudo-democratization in the country. But there's another model I think that might be applicable, which is Indonesia, and I wonder if any of the panelists have thoughts on, are there lessons from Indonesia where a military dictatorship that had been in power for also about 30 years was swept aside and it has been replaced by a functional democracy? Are there any lessons from Indonesia that could be applied to Egypt?
Okay. Marina?
Okay, concerning the position of the United States at this point and support for Iranian demonstrators, much more guarded towards other countries. It's very difficult for the Iran is simple. We have always been against the regime in Iran, so that it's not, there is no price for the United States to voice support for the Iranian demonstrations. In terms of voicing support for uprisings, for the opposition in other countries, we are trying to, it means reversing a policy that the United States has been pursuing for decades. And I am not surprised that there is a lot of hesitation in doing this. In other words, the U.S. still has very strong relations with Saudi Arabia. It still considers Saudi Arabia very important to the security of the area in terms of its policy towards Iran and so on and so forth. I'm not surprised that the U.S. is having problems. Is still trying to sit on the fence, essentially, about these countries. In Yemen, the problem is that the U.S. is involved in counter-terrorism activities, together with the government and the Yemeni army, and it's very difficult for the U.S. to let go of that. I mean, you still hear. Well, I have been hearing in the last few days the same statements that we have always heard about authoritarian regimes. That is, we still need Saleh. How are we going to continue waging war on Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula if he is gone? So essentially, if you are saying this is not a good idea because then the U.S. will risk being caught on the wrong side again in the future, I totally agree. On the other hand, I quite see why there is such a hesitation in doing this. The other issue that I think, Dan's, it was a comment and not a question. The issue of transferring of power to a civilian, to some sort of a transitional group and so on. The legality is out the window at this point. The Constitution has been suspended. I mean, I think, whatever the parties the different groups can agree to is going to fly at this point because there are really no legal restrictions. The question is not whether or not it would be a good idea. If you are asking my opinion, I think it would be an extremely good idea to set up a transitional government in which all groups are represented. But my idea does not count. I mean, the question is, can the groups come together? Can the military and the civilians come together and set up such a transitional institution? There have been demands from various opposition groups, various protesters groups to do exactly that. So far, they have not been able to get that concession from the military. I think it would be good if they did, but we have to wait and see. And very frankly, I don't think the U.S. is likely to have much say on whether or not this happens.
Michelle?
To Amin's question about the close relations between the U.S. and the Egyptian military, look, what you're pointing out is the paradox here that, the demonstrators wanted a change of regime, but of course the demonstrators never called for a change in the military leadership. Right? They were not trying to bring down the military. They wanted the military to stay there and remain a pillar of stability, and they wanted the military to get rid of Mubarak. right? And so, what was the U.S. role behind the scenes? I mean, I think we heard clearly in dealing with the Egyptian military, the message that went consistently from the U.S. was, don't fire on the demonstrators. And of course, the Egyptian military had its own good reasons for not firing on the demonstrators. It wasn't only because the U.S. told them not to, but the U.S., I think, sent a clear message about that. Don't fire on the demonstrators, and you, the military, are responsible for stability in the country. We consider you responsible, right? When we saw the thug violence and so forth, I think the U.S. sort of didn't accept that. Oh, yeah, there are rogue elements or whatever. No, we don't accept that. You are responsible for stability in the country. So those were the messages that went from the U.S. Now, the messages that we're hearing now are for, a genuine transition and so forth. But there are there are so many difficult decisions to be made. I think this issue that Marina was just talking about, the question of whether the Supreme, Military Council will be able to remain the executive body or whether there would need to be something more participatory, actually bringing opposition into that. That's certainly one of the demands of the opposition and the protesters. It's going to we're going to have to wait and see what happens inside Egypt, whether people are reasonably satisfied with what the military does or they're not, and if demonstrations return and so forth, there may need to be another change. And I agree with Marina that I think the U.S. is going to be sort of following those developments rather than leading them. I don't see the U.S. at this point, saying privately to the military, hold on, don't give in to those kind of demands or whatever. So we will see. Just briefly on the question that what Dan Serwer said, that the U.S. should not support an Egyptian government that steps back from structural reforms or should not give economic support. Look, I agree with you that certainly the other kinds of assistance we give, democracy assistance, educational assistance, and so forth, will be very important. Everybody's already gearing up for a big, the organizations that we already have organizations that are established in Egypt. They've had a lot of constraints on what they've been willing to do, but they have a presence there. Groups like NDI, IRI, IFES, Freedom House, they have been operating in Egypt under difficult circumstances, and they're gearing up now to do a lot more in terms of offering help with the administration of elections, training of political parties, monitors, all these kind of things that our organizations and European organizations typically do. So I think there will be a lot of that offered. But I do think that if we see really difficult economic circumstances developing, it's fine to say, let the international financial institutions deal with that. We shouldn't deal with that. I'm just pointing this out, that I'm flagging this issue, that I think in that circumstance, we're going to come under and feel under pressure to somehow support Egypt economically as well as with democracy assistance.
Let me just also address the issue of economic reform and how it ties with political reform. What the region needs, in my view, is more political reform and more economic reform. What I'm concerned will happen is that it will get less of both. In other words, there is a populist demand now, as has been mentioned before, that economic reform has not worked. Of course, it has not worked because it has not been coupled with political reform, and so all the economic reform measures in the region, the privatization, the liberalization of trade, all these activities really did not trickle down to the average citizen because they have been the benefits went to an elite few. And so economic reform in the region now has a bad name, and people are calling for the state to come back. People are calling for, such things as increased salaries, as ministries of supply, as controlling prices, etc. And governments might fall in the but might choose to conduct less economic reform so that they don't have to deal with the political reform aspects. I'm concerned about that, and I don't know whether we will see this. I suspect that we will, at least in the short term. I also suspect that international assistance from now on, which might have to go in the short term, to address these issues, because we do have a short-term problem that you cannot ignore. But my suspicion is that international governments are going, I don't know about international organizations, but governments are going to be a lot more, choosy and selective in giving that money without ties attached. In other words, democracy assistance programs, the Millennium Challenge account, the MEPI program, I don't think will go on as has been the case before, where in return for cosmetic changes, the U.S. will give a lot of money. I don't think this will happen. They might give lots of money now, but my prediction is that from now on it will be more closely tied to political reform in ways that was not the case before. I'm afraid this is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you soon.